The Hlanganisa Institute for Development in Southern Africa has launched a report that details the issue of gender-based violence against women living with disabilities and women with disabilities. Now, a symposium is being held this week, and this symposium will incorporate gender activists as well as think tanks who discuss the issue of violence against women. And to talk to us a little bit more about this is the Executive Director of the Hlanganisa Institute, Ms. Bongiwe Ndondo. Thank you so much for joining me. The first question really is, tell us a little bit more about the Hlanganisa Institute.
The Hlanganisa Institute works in South Africa to try and address the issues of social justice in our communities. So we have a very strong focus on community-driven approaches, and all the work that we do tries to empower community-based organizations to undertake work and activities in their communities that relate to addressing social justice.
And now in this year, this week of the 16 Days of No Violence movement, what areas are you focusing on specifically as the Hlanganisa Institute?
First of all, we've been trying to stay away from the 16 days because we believe, 16 days out of 365 days is what is fueling the problem, because we only give it attention at this time of the year. So, but to answer your question, our focus has been on gender-based violence and intersectionality, and in particular we're looking at how it intersects with disability. So we've been looking at how women with disability are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence and what some of the drivers of that vulnerability are.
Tell us a little bit more about those drivers. What are some of the drivers?
The disability itself tends to be a very important driver. So, for instance, if you cannot see, then you cannot identify anybody who performs an act of sexual violence on you. Similarly, if you're mentally disabled and you're raped, you're sexually violated, a lot of our criminal justice tends to discriminate against mentally disabled people because they're not considered reliable witnesses in court or in our courts. And the issues of economic empowerment, it's difficult enough to find a job in South Africa if you are able-bodied, and so you can imagine the kind of economic discrimination and exclusion that women with disability face. And so that economic vulnerability tends to make them dependent on other people who then become potential perpetrators of the violence.
And this is really important because you commissioned this report around gender-based violence. What role did you as Hlanganisa play with this report?
So, having worked in communities and seen some of the challenges that different types of women face with gender-based violence, we are the ones that commissioned the study, and we were trying to look at what are some of the drivers in our context in South Africa, but also what can be done, what can we do differently to protect the rights of women with disability. So we then got a researcher, Dr. Ngabaza, who worked with us to across the country to explore the views of different women and their realities.
And funding remains such a huge challenge for NGOs across the country. What are some of the private-public partnerships that you can start going into or that can be brought to you that will help alleviate the financial challenge?
In fact, before we even talk about the financial challenge, if the private sector was deliberate in giving economic opportunities and employment opportunities to women with disability, they would regain some of their respect in our communities, and that would actually improve their own self-efficacy. So we would like to see partnerships with the private sector more broadly than them just giving us money, but them, appreciating that women with disabilities are not useless, right? And giving them a space and voice in the workplace, because that would be self-reinforcing from an economic point of view, but also from a destigmatization point of view.
All right. But in terms of funding specifically for organizations, NGOs, how do you think, partnerships can be collaborated into?
I think there's a lot that can be done. So one of the things we talk about is how women with disability tend not to have access to knowledge, access to information, and therefore have very low knowledge levels. And that's because a lot of the materials that we produce are produced for people like you and I. You know, not very many of our materials are translated into Braille. You know, you go to events and there's not anybody doing sign language interpretation. So we need to mobilize resources, and the private sector has also got to come to the fore to help mobilize resources so that we can better serve the needs of women with disability.
All right, thank you so much. The Executive Director of the Hlanganisa Institute in Southern Africa, Ms. Bongiwe Ndondo, just giving us a little bit more insight about the work her institute does, as well as the report that was launched this week around the issue of gender-based violence against women with disabilities.